and open to Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17. If you will recall, last week the battle was set, the Battle of Armageddon, in the book of Revelation, chapter 16. Now that battle is not going to be fought until we get to chapter 19. But I want you to remember that these things were to shortly come to pass. You and I are not looking for a future Battle of Armageddon. This is something that John, as he was seeing it, was relaying to the 7 churches of Asia of his day, things that would affect them and not things 2,000 years off into their future. That's an extremely important thing to understand. As we get to Revelation chapter 17, we see judgment. Now, I suppose there could be several key verses to the book of Revelation to grasp the full meaning of the book in one verse. To me, it's Revelation 17:14, what Garrett just read to us. Because the whole book is about the battle between the cause of Christ and the cause of Satan. And as I've said throughout this series of lessons, there are times when it appears, and perhaps as if it felt that way to them in that first century, that their cause was losing, that there was no point in remaining faithful, and that's why they're told to remain faithful unto death, and that he would give them a crown of life, Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. There's no doubt in my mind that at times those individual Christians felt defeated and discouraged. But the point of the book of Revelation is chapter 17 and verse 14. There is a war, but the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Now that same principle applies to us today. If you're a Christian and you're walking faithfully in the light, you are called, you are chosen, and you are faithful. And so that's encouraging to us. So Revelation chapter 17 and 18 tonight, the judgment of Babylon. I want to do this a little bit differently than I've been doing it. And what I want to do tonight is focus on the characters that appear in these 2 chapters and see what we can learn from them. The most prominent character in chapters 17 and 18, and scattered throughout the rest of the book, is Babylon, the enemy of God's people. And Babylon is identified as a woman here, starting back in chapter 14 and verse 8. If you were to look at that verse, it says, "There followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she," so there's that word, she, it's a woman, "made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." And then throughout chapters 16, 17, and 18, Babylon is mentioned again specifically as a woman. What are the characteristics of these people that we're going to talk about tonight, or these images that we're going to talk about tonight? Well, first of all, Babylon, this woman, which I believe to be, and we'll develop this throughout the lesson, representative of Rome. I don't know if any of you did. I think some of you did. I shared a link earlier this week in our private Facebook group about the lesson tonight, and specifically about Revelation 17. And if you read that article, to me it's very insightful as to what we're talking about here. Babylon is not the Babylon over by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, if you're looking at your biblical maps in the book of Revelation. This is just symbolic language, as is the case with the rest of the book, identifying the enemy of God's people. And so throughout this book, she is called great and mighty. This is powerful. The political power, the religious persecution is powerful. We looked at Revelation chapter 13, where we talk about Satan's 2 allies, an oppressive government, verses 1 through 10, and then false religion, verses 11 to 18. That whole case has already been laid out. And so the opposition to Christianity is great and mighty. There's no question about that. And it's identified repeatedly from chapters 14 through 18. You will notice also that she has impacted all nations. The effect of this nation, this persecuting power, this woman against the church, includes all nations. I already read chapter 14 and verse 8. Look at chapter 18 and verse 3. It says, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." Said the same thing in chapter 14. "And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown or are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." So you have this idea of fornication mentioned repeatedly. And what that's talking about is the different groups, nations, people compromising their morals with Rome. That's what we're talking about here when we're using the term Babylon or talking about this woman throughout the book of Revelation. A compromise of morality for Christians, a compromise of their spirituality. They are spiritually fornicating with this woman as she's presented in the text. Third thing we know about her is just that's what she's known for. I mean, again, repeatedly. Look at chapter 17 and verse 2. Well, we'll start in verse 1. Look at Revelation 17:1. There came one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials, the 7 bowls of God's wrath that we looked at last week. They talked with me, saying unto me, Come here, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. That's the third time we've read that phrase, drunk with the wine of her fornication. Again, that's a representation of compromise, spiritually and morally. It's done throughout chapter 18 in at least 4 verses that's what she was known for. Something else that this beast, or rather that Babylon, this woman, is known for is the blood of the saints. Look at chapter 17 and verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. John is astonished at what he sees. Look at chapter 18 and verse 24. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. Just for a second, I want you to take your Bibles back to Revelation chapter 6. Go back to Revelation chapter 6. And this is primarily where the visions start. These images start. And this is where we have the scroll that's sealed with 7 seals. And the Lamb, you'll recall from Revelation 5, is the only one worthy to open all the seals and to reveal what's in this scroll, what God has to reveal. Look at Revelation 6 and verse 9, the 5th seal on that scroll. I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them which dwell on the earth? And white robes were given unto every one of them, and it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season. So we're still talking here in chapters 17 and 18 of the shedding of the prophets and saints' blood. Well, these souls, all the way back in the beginning of the book, rest for a little season because more blood's going to be shed. More persecution's coming. And so we're here towards the end of the book, and that's what Babylon, Rome, this woman, as they are presented, is known for, full of the blood of the saints. I'm going to read something to you here in just a minute from history about that. She's also known because she's going to incur God's wrath. Look at chapter 16 and verse 19. The great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of all nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. They're going to imbibe. They're going to take in God's wrath and judgment. Chapter 18 and verse 10 says the same thing. And once that happens, one thing that's pointed out to us is that when she falls, it's going to affect a lot of people. If you have a powerful nation, like the nation of Rome in the first century, and she's brought to her knees in judgment, that's going to affect a major portion of society in terms of trade, economics, the political scene. All of that's going to be shaken up when this nation falls. Look at chapter 18, for instance, starting in verse 1. After these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the habitation of demons, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. And again, that idea is reiterated. You look at we're not going to read all of this, but chapter 18, beginning in verse 9, down through verse 19, talks about how all the other nations are going to be impacted, again, by trade and economics. And it's quite extensive. That great city that used to be clothed has fallen. In fact, look at chapter 18 and verse 17. In 1 hour, so great riches have come to naught. You know, when God judges a nation, he can do it rapidly. I think a good example of that is in the book of Daniel, in the changing of the guard, if you will, from the Babylonians to the Persians. The end of Daniel chapter 5 talks about the death of a Babylonian leader and how Darius the Mede came to power that night. And so, with God, as we say sometimes, behind the scenes, in control of this whole scheme, this whole plan, things can happen quickly. So that's Babylon. I'm going to answer the question, well, how do you know that's Rome? Here in just a minute, and I hope that you'll be able to see it. Let's talk about the beast now. Look at chapter 17 and verse 3. We've already been introduced to several beasts in the book of Revelation. Revelation 17, verse 3. He carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But this takes my mind back to Revelation chapter 13. Again, there are 2 beasts presented to us there. One comes out of the sea, one comes from the dry ground, and they're representative, again, of political oppression and false religion, or deception. Well, this beast here is blasphemous, as we just noticed in chapter 17, verse 3. Names of blasphemy. Well, that's blasphemy against God, obviously. 7 heads and 10 horns. 7 heads and 10 horns. What are we talking about here? Turn back to chapter 13. I've mentioned this a couple of times. When we're talking about heads on these beasts and horns and crowns, which we've read about throughout the book of Revelation, my mind immediately goes back to the book of Daniel. And if you're a good student of your Old Testament, there are so many similarities between the visions of Daniel, particularly Daniel chapter 7, and what we see here in Revelation. Revelation 13:1. I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So now we're seeing that again in Revelation chapter 17. And upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. That's exactly what we're seeing here in Revelation 17:3. 7 heads, 10 horns, names of blasphemies. This is the beast. All of that, simply put, is representative of political leaders, political power. And here's the thing about this. It might be easier to teach a class on the book of Revelation, to have the back and forth, to have the dialogue. But I'm not trying to drag this out and spend 4 years in study of the book of Revelation. As many commentaries as I read on the book of Revelation are just about as many views as there are on, well, who are these political leaders? Who is the political power? Well, it depends on who you start with and where you end up, the Caesars and going through all of these Roman leaders. What is it that I've said throughout this series of lessons? Don't get lost in the imagery. So many people get lost in the imagery, and I'm not saying you can't study that and try to put pieces together, again, particularly from the book of Daniel. But the idea is this beast that is rising to fight against God's cause, to persecute God's people, is extremely powerful, and it's from the political realm. But there's something else in here. Again, back to chapter 13 and verse 1. This beast is rising up out of the sea, 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns. We see the same thing in Revelation 17 and verse 3. How do you know this is Rome? Well, there's a clue in the text. Look at chapter 17 and verse 8. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition or destruction. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they beheld the beast that was and is not and yet is. That's confusing language. That is difficult to understand. I'm not going to play any games here. But look at verse 9. Who are we talking about? Here is the mind which has wisdom. So John's getting ready to clue us in on something. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Okay, so think if the woman, who is also called Babylon, is representative of Rome, then that's who we're talking about here. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. You know what Rome was known as in the first century and throughout ancient history? The city that sits on 7 hills. That was part of that article that I shared with you. And so you notice the language here. There are times when John clues us in on something, that he's telling us exactly what he means. Revelation 17:9, here is the mind who has wisdom. Pay attention to what I'm saying. That this image of this beast and the fight against God's cause and God's people, it represents the city that sits on 7 hills. That's Rome. And that powerful enemy of God's people, the point being here in chapters 17 and 18, she's going to fall. Notice the tie-in with the bottomless pit in Revelation chapter 17, verse 18. We're going to read about that later on in the book. That's tied in with Satan, isn't it? He's cast into the bottomless pit. He's given the key to the bottomless pit, in fact. This beast gives power. Look at chapter 17 and verse 13. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These are the enemies of God's people, because look at verse 14. These will make war with the Lamb. False religion, political oppression, very powerful, killing Christians on a regular basis. But they're going to fight. They're going to keep fighting, but they're going to lose. I want to read this to you now in connection with this particular beast, talking about the persecution, the blasphemy, the political power, and exactly what they were doing in the first century against Christians. And it's a bit lengthy, so bear with me. But this is a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. And Tacitus was not a friend to Christians. Here's what he writes in, well, it's called the Annals of Tacitus. Quote, such indeed were the precautions of human wisdom. The next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods, and recourse was had to the Sibylline books by the directions which prayers were offered to Vulcanus, Ceres, and Proserpina, these different gods. There were sacred banquets and nightly vigils celebrated by married women, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order, this party. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So Nero is emperor of Rome in the 60s. I believe he died in 68, AD 68. But anyway, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. You recall that when Rome burned, Nero blamed the Christians. That's what's being talked about here. So what did they do? What did Rome do as a result of that false information? Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, to the Christians' deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloof on a cart. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to express one's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. This is written by an enemy of Christianity who's speaking about the persecution against the Christians, being used as torches, again, covered in dead animal skins and then fed to wild animals, crucified on a regular basis. Here's a here are some words of Tiberius Caesar. He is not thirsty for neat wine as he was thirsty then, but warm him up a tastier cup, the blood of murdered men. Nero in his persecution of the Christians and other Roman emperors were insatiable. There was never enough Christian blood shed. And a lot of people will tell us, well, that's one of the things that led to the downfall of Rome was the absolute and unnecessary brutality towards Christians. It caused a rift in the empire, among other things. But when we're reading about this woman in Revelation, well, beginning in chapter 14, but specifically 17 and 18, and the beast and the power that they have and the difficulty that the Christians are facing, it's hard to appreciate fully how bad it really was and how brutal the Christians were being treated. So that brings us to the next character, and that's the saints. What are they doing? Well, look at chapter 17 and verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. He's not admiring her as we think of the term admiration. He's amazed that she has gotten this far, that Rome has become this brutal towards these followers of Christ. She's drunk with their blood. The woman, Rome, is drunk with the blood of the saints. The slain on the earth, they're the result of her wickedness and their persecution against the church. But here's the key, and again, this is the whole theme of the book of Revelation. They are with the Lamb, and they are victorious. Again, look at that verse, chapter 17, 14. These, the beast, the woman, the unredeemed, will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. This is the overarching theme of the book of Revelation. With all of the imagery, with all of the symbolism, here's your central theme. Satan and his allies have done their absolute best to thwart God's purpose. If you remember back in chapter 12, there's a dragon presented as pursuing a woman who is pregnant. She gives birth to a male child. He can't destroy the male child. He can't destroy the woman. Everything he tried to do against God's cause and against God's people fails. He's done his best and has repeatedly failed. Now, as you get into Revelation chapters 9, well, specifically chapter 19, now we have the Battle of Armageddon. We're not going to get into that tonight, obviously. The battle's been drawn up, chapter 16. The battle's fought in Revelation chapter 19. But we're told right here in chapter 17 that the Lamb is victorious. And don't you think the Christians need to hear that? With the daily shedding of their blood, imprisonments, again, economic consequences, social consequences, death, the blood of the martyrs is being shed, and the text identifies it as so much and so brutal that the city, this woman, is full of the blood of the saints. It's like overflowing because of the persecution that's being faced. But again, look at the end of chapter 17 and verse 14. They that are with him, with the Lamb, are called and chosen and faithful. You and I, think about those three words. All right, you're called by the gospel. 2 Thessalonians 2:14. These people were called by the gospel, just like you and I are. They're trying to live out their Christian life, and they're being put to death for it. They're chosen. Well, when you obey the gospel, when you become a child of God, you are one of the chosen. But then the third is key. They're faithful. That takes us all the way back to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life. These people were dying on a daily basis. These Christians were dying, being imprisoned, being used as torches, all those things described by Tacitus, and yet they were faithful. I wonder sometimes if our current culture, Christian culture, would be able to say that kind of thing in the face of that type of persecution. We need to think about that. Am I faithful? Am I, one of the definitions of the term that's rendered faithful there is dependable, trustworthy. Is that descriptive of us? Are we faithful to God no matter what? If not, we need to make some changes. If you're not a Christian yet, you need to make some changes. You can have your sins washed in the blood of the Lamb, Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. You do that when you submit to His will to be baptized for the remission of sins. If you're ready to do that, we want to encourage you to become a Christian. If you're not faithful, as these people are described in Revelation 17:14, what's the cause? Is your life in danger? Are you threatened with prison because what's really causing Christians to be unfaithful today? There's not a whole lot going against us in terms of comparison with the first century Christians. Are you faithful? If not, let's make some changes. There's sin in your life. Let's repent of that and pray to God for forgiveness, and we have the assurance that He'll hear us and forgive us. If you're ready to obey the gospel tonight or to come back, let's take care of it right now as we stand and sing.